So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Textile of the Month group, where this is September 2023, and today we'll be talking about a category of Japanese textiles called Monro, okay? Mon means crest, and Ro means a type of lino weave, which we'll go into in greater detail in just a moment, okay? So let's start with screen share here, and we'll pull up our video that I've prepared. And here we go. So again, Mondo is a type of figurative weaving. Now, I'd like to take a moment, though, also to tell you how that's different than some other types of lino. So once more, the character is crest, like family crest, or figure is what it means. And ro is one type of a weaving category called Karamiori. So the dark image you see on the screen right now is one example of Monro. You can see the figure of the clouds in it. Now, the garment this woman is wearing is actually a Sha type weave, one type of Karamiori. Karamiori, means weave. Karami means to be tangled or knotted. And so in the case of our categories here, Sha is the simplest type of gauze weaving in Japanese, aside from a spaced flat weave, okay? And as you can see with what we call in English lino, the twisting lines go back and forth as they secure in place the weft. Now, if I were to take this and rub it forcefully left to right, it would bruise, meaning those threads would shift because they're not knotted in that direction. But if I were to apply a pressure going up and down with it, the weft would stay in place. Okay, that's what the lino does. It twists and holds the weft thread normally in place. Okay, now the very center one, the ro, which is what we'll be talking about today, you'll notice it has that simple twist. And then it also has flat weaving in between, or balanced weaving in between. And that's what creates our figures as we manipulate where the flat weave hits in our design. And as we use these X's, the twist of the lino weave, to space our threads, okay? And you'll see how that plays out in just a moment. And then there's one last category of lino weave of Karamiori called da, which we'll be discussing at another time. Da is a little bit more akin to sort of macrame on the surface, okay? Sha and Ro, you can tell by the Japanese characters, both come from weaving traditions, whereas Ra actually comes from a fisherman's netting tradition. But for our purposes, they're all classed together as Karamiori. Let's take a look at Sha first. So as I mentioned, you have these simple undulating lines twisting around the weft. And here's a little bit, although a little bit blurry line. You can see how the weft thread, which is the white one, is pinched between these two pretzel-like sections of the warp. And this gives you a detail of the actual weaving itself. Okay, now if we put that into practice, then you see you have a very nice, beautiful weave here. You see it appears to be almost a checkered patterning. Well, of course, those little squares are the gaps between the weave that's being held. There's no particular pattern in this. It's just a, as I say, sort of a checkerboard look to it, but it's very open, very gauzy. These are normally used for summer garments because they allow the air to flow through more easily and they're lighter weight. This is an example of a Buddhist monk's Sha garment that's being worn over the top of the rest of his clothing. And you can see the beads, the rosary that he has showing through the fabric, which gives you an idea of how transparent it is. And if you've been to Japan in the summertime, you know how hot and muggy it is. And so any relief you can manage is appreciated. Now going on to the ro, again, you see this flat weave section here. And if we enlarge it, let me stop, oops, back up just a minute here. So if we look at this again, you have the undulating line up until the point you hit this weft, and then it becomes a flat weave. Now, this is a three weft type of ro. There are 5 weft, 7 weft. They're categories by the number of weft threads in the flat weave before it reverts to the twisting. Okay, that's not really necessary for you to know, but just do know it's not limited to 3. You can go on for quite a large space with the flat weave before the twisting is reintroduced to create spacing. Now, this is a simple stripe, as you just saw in the diagram. So here we have a 3-strand weft lino weave, and you can see again the twist in between each row is what holds the spacing in place. When it twists, what happens is it actually pinches the weft thread a tiny bit, compressing it. And when it reverts to the flat, that allows the thread to splay out a little bit more. So even though the weft yarn is of consistent thickness, it appears thinner in the twist and it appears wider in the flat weave. And that's often used to the designer's advantage when weaving. Here's another example of ro, and you can see right here we have the 3-strand of weft, but in this case it has 2 twists in between, giving us a tiny stripe of a different nature and a larger gap. And so the flat weave is played against the open areas to create this large checkered pattern. And lastly, la, which we discussed a moment ago. And here again, you can see that the warp thread, the lino thread, does play a very important role, but it's no longer in an up and down stripe. It's dancing around quite a bit to the left and quite a bit to the right to create an almost macrame effect. And this gives you an idea of both the yarns and a woven piece. Okay, and this gives you an example of a woven obi done in that fashion. Now, I'm giving some other examples because I don't want you to confuse the two. This also has an open weave to it, and it can possibly be a gauze in the background, but it actually is cut work. So these openings here have been either pushed aside or snipped and then thread bound around to pull in the warp threads and the weft threads to create this open patterning, and that's called cut work or open work. And that's not what we're talking about in this class. This is another version of that. Now, the background you can see is a weft stripe ro patterning, and that gauze work has then been cut. So this is both. This is our mondo striping, our yokoro striping, and our cut work combined. Then the other a couple of other examples of items that appear to be the same but are not. This is lace work. So you can see the netting in the background upon which the additional filler has been placed. These are done both by machine and hand. This is a machine done one. And this gives you an idea of what it looks like. Oops. Okay. And here we have some more lace work. And this is Devereux. Devereux, if you're not familiar with it, is also called burnout for good reason. Quite often the base foundation is silk, and it's woven with an additional weft thread of rayon. Once the entire fabric is finished, it basically looks like a solid piece of fabric, one color, no patterning. Through stencils or printing techniques, a chemical is applied to it. This chemical burns out the rayon but doesn't harm the silk. So the chemical attacks cellulose fiber not, oh, excuse me, actually, it doesn't attack the cellulose. It attacks the bonding agent, the glue that's holding the wood together in the rayon. Rayon, as you know, is made from wood pulp and glue. And so this chemical destroys the glue, makes that part of this rayon fiber to disintegrate, leaving the silk below intact. So what you wind up with is a rayon pattern, this white part, that hasn't been touched by the chemical. It's just fine. Nothing was applied. But in this background area where the chemical was applied, the acid-like substance etched away all of the rayon that was there, leaving only the silk. And you get this beautiful effect. This is quite common nowadays. It's a popular type of weave, both in Japan and in the United States. Okay. And then there's another type that can very easily be confused, and that's called kushiori. Kushi means comb, and you'll use a comb. Banda, this is what you just ordered, okay? You'll use the comb to basically bruise the fabric. Remember earlier in the talk today, I mentioned using my fingers or applying pressure to push the fabric aside, to bruise it, basically, using that interesting structure of the lino weave to work with it. So that's what's happening here. Often there's a lino weave. Sometimes it's not lino, but most often it is. And a comb or a pick is used to nudge the fabric in one direction to create patterning. And that's called kushiori, but it is not ro, because the pattern is not woven in. It's physically manipulated after the weaving is done. Okay, and then within the ro category, there is the yokoro, which I've already mentioned. Those are the bands going sideways. And let's count these. Let's see, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is a 5-strand band for the yokoro. And there's also a warp type of ro called tatero. Okay, tate means warp. And so here again, it still has the same thing happening, though. You have some lino weave in combination with the flat weave. The stripes simply are going vertically rather than horizontally. And this gives you an idea of a type of kimono, haori, I should say, that would be employed using that type of weaving patterning. And then lastly, or now we're really getting into the category of today, is monro. As I mentioned earlier, mon means, in this case, figurative, but it also means crest, like kamon. Kamon is family crest. I'm sure you've seen it in other situations. So here we have another example of the monro, and perhaps you can see on your screen that these lines are those weft stripes that we looked at a moment ago with the lino twist in between. And then the areas in between creating these arches are the flat weave. And again, back to this image we saw a moment ago, but perhaps now you can appreciate it a bit better. The diamond section here is the flat weave, and the open gaps between are where the twists of the lino go, have been used. And this is an example of a beautiful summer piece, a woman's kimono. And you can see, once again, that the stripes have been used to create open spaces, and then additional patterning, in this case, not flat weave, but in this case, greater areas of lino have been left so that these arches are open, allowing for more airflow, and then the design is filled in with the lino stripes. So this is true Monro. You have figurative patterning within this lino. One other very popular type of lino, Monro, is a double weave. So in this case, 2 layers are used. As they appear as one, you can't separate them. There is a black on top and a red on the bottom. And so while manipulating the threads, the red occasionally pokes to the top and the black to the back, which gives you these red wave patterns. when the red peaks to the front. And whether the threads are peaking to the front or not, you can see this isn't a true black, although the thread is black and the thread is red. It gives you this wonderful gradation, this moire effect. You can see this sort of patterning, very modern looking patterning happening as the two layers are seen through each other. It creates this movement and a sense of coolness in the summertime. But again, it is one layer of fabric. Okay, this is another example of that, where the red peeking through from the back is the flat weave, and the black appearing on the surface is the lino weave. So let's see what happens here. This is the piece we just looked at. If we looked in the upper corner, we'll see this butterfly and these interesting blurs that are happening. Those blurs are only caused where the back layer is seen through the gauze to the front, creating this type of shimmering. And on the right, you can see a very simple gauze worn as the Buddhist, one of the Buddhist garments for this young monk. The key factor of all of these lino weaves that we're talking about is this sheerness, this not translucently, but this thinness of fabric, this openness of the weave that allows you to see through. So even though this clothing is still really hot, he's obviously wearing 4 or 5 layers of fabric, still it gives the illusion, at least to the viewer, that he's cool, whether he is or not. For this is years and years ago, but for those of you who remember Mrs. Kanematsu, we went to the pyramids in Mexico and were climbing up those. And that was her first trip to the United States. And she wanted to, present her national pride. So she had a beautiful sage green Monro kimono made just for the occasion. And under it, she wore white garments. And so I was watching her as she was getting prepared and dressing for our hike. And she must have had 6 layers of clothing on. This is summertime in Mexico. It was not cool. And she had her, Japanese zori on and was climbing up the steps with the rest of us. And I commented that she must be incredibly hot wearing that. She says she is, but the point again is for the people around her to feel refreshed because the fabric makes her look cool and comfortable, even though she's not. So it's all just the illusion that the fabric is presenting on behalf of the wearer. And here again, you can see where these threads overlap and create this additional movement in the background. Now we're finally arriving at our sample of the month. So this is from a Buddhist monk's robe, as those I've shown you already. It would be worn in the summertime, probably in Kyoto. And it has this typical Chinese-style dragon with the clouds in it. So let's take a closer look at that. On the left is the dragon, on the right is the cloud. I'm going to focus on the cloud because it's a little bit less complex and easier to show you what's happening. So if we enlarge that, you can start to see what I was mentioning perhaps. On the left-hand side here, if you can see my cursor moving, the bundle, because of the lino twist, is pulled into a circular, smaller appearing bundle. But as we move to the left and go into the flat weave, where it's no longer constricted, the thread itself appears to splay out and get wider, which accentuates the difference between the flat weave and the lino by closing up any gap. Okay, let's take even a little bit closer look at this. You may want to come back later and examine this in greater detail or look at your sample. Okay, so here's the lino twist that you can see going on here. Okay, right next to it, of course, is another one. And what's also interesting, if you'll notice, I'm talking right about this middle section. There is this, let's count how many strands. 1, 2, but you can see there's another one. There appear to be at least 3 strands here forming the lino. And as they get beyond the twist and hit the flat weave, you can see they start to separate. Now follow this with me. This particular strand from the lino comes over this weft. Two of the strands go under. The second strand comes over, under consistently. But there's one underneath it, I hope you can see, that actually travels underneath the weft thread 3 or 4 strands before it surfaces again. So even though I'm calling this a flat weave, it's not a simple flat weave. It's doing everything it can on a minute scale to flatten, to matte, to block the light transfer through these islands of the figure, to create greater contrast between the filled in section and the open back of the gauze. And again, the gauze constricts the thread, makes it narrower. The flat area allows the thread, the weft thread, to open up and become wider. That's really maybe not that complicated, or perhaps for those of you who are weavers, not that big a deal. But if you look at what they were able to accomplish with that and to plan out, to me, it's truly mind-boggling. It's really easy to dismiss these fabrics. This type of Mondo quite often does not have any additional dye work. Quite often it's a solid color. Very often it's a solid black. And so when we're going through our treasures and things, we just sort of look past it as another black gauze. But actually, if you take time and examine them, you'll see that there's some spectacular creations within your own collection. So just as a brief review once more, we have the Sha, which is the simple gauze. We have the Ro, Mondo in particular, that we're talking about today. And then we have the Ra, by contrast, which is the more complex version. Okay, so that basically is it for our talk today. It was relatively short. So I'm going to go ahead and end this session, and I'll invite all of the attendees to go ahead and put back on your videos, and we'll continue with your questions, okay?